Hello there, aspirational explorer, and welcome to this first ever episode of the podcast where you can join me in my quest to learn to fly an aeroplane in a bit of an unusual manner. How? Well, the plan is simple but not easy. I will be using a 1940s self-study guide for fighter pilots. So will a 70-year-old guidebook for the RAF be enough to get me safely into the air and back on the ground? Well, we'll be finding that out together. My name is Thomas, and I will be the main voice inside your head for the next few minutes. All that is required now is a bit of a jingle to appear more professional than we really are. In this audio narrative, we will go on a bit of a flying expedition together. I will attempt to learn to fly a plane, and for that I will be basing myself on a very, very old do-it-yourself book that didn't really have people like me in mind as the target audience. Since this is the, pilot episode, I think it's best to provide you with a little bit of background info first. Now, first I have a few things to explain that are quite crucial for the bigger picture. I was born and raised in the most inoffensive, nondescript country in the world, and for those of you who know me, yes, I am talking about Belgium. Some people think Belgium is the capital of Brussels, others are convinced it's a waffle factory near Paris, but your thinking would be misplaced. It is a country in itself indeed. Belgium was actually designed in the early 1800s using the ingredients of some slightly more exciting countries in Europe. So all of the traits of the UK, France, Germany and the Netherlands got put in a large blender to end up with a very safe, moderate and bland country where risks are to be avoided at all costs, because what if something happened that was perhaps too exciting to handle? You might even start enjoying things, and that could have very grave consequences. And in that safe haven that Belgium was and still is, I used to go to primary school in a very small and reasonably affluent town. That was back in the 90s that I'm talking about, where most of our days were characterised by playing Pokemon on the Game Boy and roaming the streets on our bicycles. Now, despite our young age, all of us were quite certain that we would grow up to become very interesting and important people when we were grown up. So in my classroom of 20 alone, there were 3 future vets, a handful of firefighters, and even 2 prime ministers to be, or so they thought at least. And how about myself? Well, I wanted to become either an astronaut or an airline pilot, depending on my mood. I cannot quite recall why exactly that is or how it came about, because I wasn't particularly brave, and neither was I very good at maths. I didn't really have any of the qualities that might come in handy trying to navigate a space shuttle, but the idea just sort of stuck in my head, and it remained there for a while. Until, of course, reality caught up with most of us, except perhaps for the people who'd set more realistic expectations for their professional occupation. I myself went on to study a few different things with reasonable success, but my subjects weren't remotely related to anything to do with flying. Most of my former classmates ended up making their mothers very proud with sensible careers in banking or electrical engineering, things like that, and whenever I speak with them now, they give me tips on extremely important things that I wasn't even aware of before usually, like credit insurance or leaving the washing machine running whilst you're out of the house, because that's apparently very, very dangerous. I decided to go for a career doing all sorts of digital consulting and copywriting, and I sort of forgot about the idea of learning to fly altogether. It would be very expensive, I was never going to become an airline pilot anyway, and my maths and physics were still very, very average.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main beam bus on a bolt.
Okay, stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
And then one day, not so long ago, I went out for drinks with a friend of mine called Jonas. Normally we see each other every other month or so, and we usually talk about, just things that men tend to talk about. So I've known him for roughly 15 years now, but I've still got to ask him whether he has any siblings or if he's still happy with his girlfriend. But I do know everything about every car he's ever driven, and we have solved multiple international political conflicts over drinks. So I was sat down with Jonas and we were discussing plans for ourselves and our partners, and I told him that I wanted to maybe take a break for a short while and learn something completely different for a few months. Just usual daydreaming, nothing too serious or realistic at first. And as we were talking, the subject changed to aviation, and Jonas kindly reminded me of a rather silly episode during my teenage years where I used to be completely hooked on Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now, if you're not familiar with that, Flight Simulator is essentially a computer game that allows you to fly all different kinds of aeroplanes and helicopters. And next to that, it also has fairly advanced flight control settings that allow you to familiarize yourself with some of the instruments on the most common planes. So me and my friend Jonas were sort of joking how about I should perhaps try to learn to fly a real plane, since we reckoned I would already know half the stuff anyway, from flying choppers around a digital Caribbean island and doing all sorts of online flying. And of course I didn't really take it seriously in that moment. But later that evening, I started to think about it, and I even looked into some of the formalities and requirements that go into qualifying as a pilot for small planes. And when I say small planes, I really mean those midget-sized aircraft with no retractable landing gear, so the sort of small planes that really make a lot of noise and don't get you very far. At the time, I just saw it as a silly idea, but the seed had been planted, and the proverbial mental tree of flying plans started growing and growing. But one thing was still missing. That was a trigger that would set things in motion properly. And that trigger actually presented itself only a very short while ago, in the form of a small guidebook that caught my girlfriend's eye in an obscure second-hand bookshop, completely in keeping with the cliché, but it is actually true. And now we are actually getting to the essence of what this podcast is all about. So the book in question that I found at the bookshop is called Teach Yourself to Fly, written by the late Nigel Tanguy. And I'm sure there will be an episode on the author of the book later on, because the life story of this aviator and jack of all trades is really quite spectacular. But the most important thing for now is that he wrote a flying book for people who didn't really have a clue, just like me. The only minor drawback for the present-day use of this flying guide, though, is that it was written in 1939 as a first version. So Teach Yourself to Fly was actually designed as a quick and dirty guide aimed at prospective Royal Air Force pilots who were about to join the ranks of one of the fighter squadrons that fought for Britain in the Second World War. And back in the day, any reasonably fit, able young man in Britain who was capable of spelling their own name would be conscripted into the army, and the priority was to get young men into the air as quickly as possible and take down as many Messerschmitts as possible before you got shot at yourself. Nevertheless, I thought it might be a good opportunity for me to try to learn to fly a plane using this 1940s book, a bit of a different angle, even though I'm very well aware that the book might cut a few corners here and there, as there wasn't really so much of a focus on safety, as we'll see later on. The RAF pilots were going to war, after all. So for now, I will also try to ignore the fact that aeroplanes in the 1940s were, let's say, slightly different from the ones that are in use now, but I suppose it's best to, completely forget about that fact for now. I'm also not sure if I will actually be able to get my hands on the Spitfire. That was the main fighter plane of the Royal Air Force at the time, but we will cross that bridge when we get there. For now, all I really need is your emotional support as we are about to embark on this journey together. I think the deal is actually a very good one for you. I will be taking all the risks in your place, like a middle-class version of Indiana Jones. Truth be told, I have set up a backup plan in the form of actual present-day study books, and more importantly, I also signed up for a very real and practical flying course near Valencia in Spain, with very real and qualified instructors. just in case the 70-year-old guide does not suffice. Also, I will need access to a real plane at some point, which is surprisingly more difficult these days than it was back in the 1940s. Okay, let's just briefly go through the introduction of Teach Yourself to Fly to see what flying was actually like in the late 30s and early 40s. Just as a reminder for those who used to bunk off during their history classes, this book is set in times of, on the one hand, very little modern technology, and on the other hand, great uncertainty, with a full-scale global war developing right in front of people's eyes. One of the first things that Nigel Tanguy suggests in his book is to take a flight as a passenger to see how your body responds to flying. Now, I've done that on large jetliners many times before, but only once have I had the opportunity to sit inside the small cockpit of a tiny single-propeller aeroplane, and I have to say it is quite different indeed. So let's listen to an excerpt of some of Nigel Tanguy's advice as he wrote it down in 1939.
You will gain considerable assistance for your study of this book if you take a passenger flight in an aeroplane first. This experience will make everything easier for you to appreciate, because you will be able to have a realistic background in your mind of what it feels like to fly and what the Earth looks like far below you. Do not choose as your pilot a friend who thinks it's a good opportunity to show off. An experienced pilot knows that when he is taking up a passenger on his first flight, the novelty of flying is quite enough to make him appreciatively impressed by the pilot's capabilities. He does not wish to be thrown about in the sky, as is so often done by the young and arrogant pilot who is taking up a friend for the first time. A fine pilot just simply will not throw his plane about under these circumstances, unless you specifically ask him to do so. A joyride flight is also not so out of reach as is often thought. The cost is from as little as 5 shillings for a 5-minute trip, up to anything you like to pay. Take the earliest opportunity, therefore, to find out which is your nearest aerodrome where joyrides are given, and then go and have your baptism of the air. It will be a glorious experience, and one which you will never forget.
Now, that's just a small portion of the introduction, and there are already a few things that strike me. I do quite like the use of the word joyride. I think we should reintroduce the term with that slightly more positive meaning. More worrying to me, though, is the casual mention of aerobatics on a first flight. I most certainly did not get presented with that option during my aerial baptism, and I just don't think that air acrobatics are standard practice anymore. There is a section on aerobatics further along in the pilot guide, though, so I'll have to see how we can put that into practice. It certainly was a lot cheaper to fly back in the day, though. The author mentions a price of 5 shillings for a quick flight, and I had a brief look at what that would be in today's money. So taking into account the inflation rate and average wages, 5 shillings would now be the equivalent of around £25 sterling in today's money, so quite a bargain. I'm actually doubting whether this book is going to be so compatible with the world of aviation today, but I suppose I'll have to go along with it for as long as possible. Perhaps for the next episode we should compare the modern day books and get some extra insights from experts. This will do for our first episode. I will now vacate your ears and clear you to get back to the real world, full of work emails, needy children, and the occasional happy Netflix moment. Feedback is most welcome. Please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends, family, housemates, or your cat. There is also a Facebook page, and you can follow the blog, which has a transcript of this episode as well as plenty of additional material. For now, goodbye.